We're not broadcasting. Hang on a second. I have to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, sorry. I wasn't sure what.
So we don't need to mute ourselves.
You can if you want to. I'm going to start broadcasting now.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Exploring and Understanding Islamophobia, which is part of our anti-oppression webinar series. I'm Laura Kitzmiller, Professional Development and Program Marketing Manager here at the SE Institute. I'm pleased to introduce Andrew Idris Watts and Hannah Pauls. Andrew Watts converted to Islam in 1998 when he was studying Arabic studies at Leeds University in the UK. He went on to live in Fez, Morocco for 6 years from 2002 to 2008, where he studied traditional Islamic studies at one of the oldest universities in the world, the Qarawiyyin. He came back to the UK in 2008 and has been working with and living in local West Yorkshire community for the last 12 years, providing a pastoral and religious educational role mainly among the South Asian Muslim community. He is also an advanced student in his third and final year in the Somatic Experiencing program and currently is training as a counselor. He is also a teacher of Arabic. He has a one-year program designed for people to access the Quran in the original Arabic language to appreciate its true message and the beauty of its language. Hannah Pauls is a qualified midwife, naturopathic and herbal practitioner of Greco-Arab medicine, and more recently, a somatic experiencing practitioner. She is passionate about holistic medicine and demystifying generally held misconceptions surrounding natural birth and well-being. Her passion is embedded in a philosophy of attending to the individual from a biopsychosocial perspective, and in doing so, liberating and empowering them all in their being. She's the co-founder and resident practitioner at the Garden Clinic here in Liverpool, from where she runs a clinical practice, as well as providing educational initiatives and workshops. Her dedication and commitment in the field of midwifery has enabled a synergy between conventional midwifery and holistic approaches that resulted in the introduction of aromatherapy in childbirth and hypnobirthing programs into clinical practice at the Liverpool Women's Hospital, which is Europe's largest maternity unit. She is a strong advocate for expanding the boundaries of women-centered care, and is currently furthering her studies in herbal medicine and body-based trauma therapy. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew and Hannah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Laura. Can everybody hear me? Am I clear? Madeline, can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, fantastic.
I can hear you.
Right, evening guys. Well, evening our end. Good morning to you for those who are on the other side of the coast. And thank you very much for Laura introducing us. And thank you very much for Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute for making this webinar a possibility. We're really grateful, and we're really looking forward to being able to share with you this issue that's very, very, very important in this time and age, and in light of the current political situation as well. And what we're going to really be looking at is how it's so easy to demonize a people when emotions are high politically, and what impact that can have on the communities as well. What we're really appreciative as well in the somatic experiencing work is how Islam, being a very embodied religion in terms of the prayer being very physical, how somatic experiencing has really helped the Muslim community that we've worked with, in Hannah's community and my community, and how there's a real, just as there's a revolution, I think we can say, in terms of embodied approaches across the board, we really see that within our own community as well, with people such as Hakeem Archuleta, who's been pioneering this work for many, many decades now. And myself and another practitioner, Mazin Abdasi, we're both students of his, and as well as Hannah doing some really, really good work in Liverpool. So we hope you enjoy the presentation, and I give it over to Hannah.
So hi everyone, or good evening and good morning from Liverpool. Obviously, as Laura's just kindly introduced both Andrew and myself, I'm Hannah. And we both, when we were talking about delivering this presentation, what our intention was to not assume that every person attending this webinar will be SE or somatic experiencing sort of literate. So the beginning of our presentation, before we went on to talk about our stories, what we really hoped to do was just explain some of the fundamentals of somatic experiencing, what we meant by certain terminology such as the felt sense or sensations. We thought it'd be nice to give a brief sort of introduction to some of the exercises we're going to be doing and some of the principles behind that. So what I'm going to do now is I will go on to screen share. And as I do, sorry, one second, hopefully you can see my screen. Does that come up for everybody? Yeah, brilliant. So what I will do is I will start off the first sort of couple of slides, just explaining principles. One of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to introduce thoughts, sensations, and emotions to you as guests. Now, Rumi is a very famous poet, and I recently learned that apparently in America, he's quite a famous poet there. He's a Persian poet, and one of the things that he was able to do, one of the things that he was able to do was very beautifully in this particular poem, be able to describe the human being as a guest house and everything that the human being experiences in the form of thoughts, sensations and feelings, he described as guests. So I thought it'd be wonderful to share this poem with you as a starter to what we meant by sort of the felt sense, what we mean by tracking, what we mean by sensations in the body. So Rumi says, the guest house, this being human is a guest house, and every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. So momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house, empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight, the dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door, laughing, and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So when we sort of frame emotions, sensations, and thoughts in this way, we can begin to see that actually they're not us, you know, they're separate entities to us. And so in that regard, the guest house so that brings me on to kind of my next slide. In many ancient traditions, one of the things that you'll find is that we're encouraged to observe our sensory experience in quite a neutral manner. And you'll find that somatic experiencing also encourages us to do this. When you observe your breathing, you observe your sensations, you observe your emotions and your thoughts and so on and so forth, without actually reacting to them, you'll find that what happens is healing begins to occur by observing, by feeling, by leaning into them, by sitting in them. What we find is that there's this transformation that occurs, there's this release, there's this discharge, there's this ability to have better containment. Now, this observer technique works really well because what you begin to do is develop some sort of what we call an outside perspective of your own experience. You can watch your own mind, your reactions, your emotions, your behaviors, almost from this perspective of what we would call another person. And, you know, this can be really tremendous as a feedback for us to have. And, you know, the whole intention behind this is that by doing this, by being able to observe our thoughts, sensations, and emotions, we hope that we are able to better regulate what more resilient, and that there's better containment then that results in this. And this is one of the beautiful things about somatic experiencing, is that we, again, if we use another sort of quote by Rumi that I think is very beautiful, and I believe that this title of the book book Unspoken Voice, says there is a voice that doesn't use words, listen. And so here, the voice that doesn't use words is the body. And what we're inviting individuals to do is to start listening to the body. When they come, where do I notice them? And what are they sort of telling me of? What is the story of the body? And how can I be better attuned to this? I thought it'd be helpful to sort of make a list here of some of the sensations that people will experience within their bodies. I think sometimes when we talk about thoughts, people are familiar with the idea and the concept of thoughts. They're familiar with the concept of emotions. But when we begin to talk about sensations, here now people are a little bit like, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean. So we thought it'd be great here when we do talk about sensations in the exercises that will follow in this webinar, it'd be good for you to be able to know what it is that we're meaning. And sensations here can, sort of be very varied. You can have sensations that are quite expansive, and there in the column of that I've put, you can see that that can be feelings of calmness, of feeling warm, of feeling flow, of feeling fluid, of being spacious and airy. And there are constricting ones that we can feel heavy or blocked or frozen or knotted. There are movement type sensations, such as ones that make us feel a bit shaky, where we can feel a bit trembly, fluttery, queasy, spacey. And there's nervy ones as well, which I'm not going to read through. But one of the important things I really feel about going through sensations is that many of us will anchor difficult sensations in the body and will really focus on them. We rarely sometimes will focus on the sort of more expansive or the pleasant and the more comfortable sensations that we can experience in the body. So it's nice, this is a language that we're learning. And some of us are new to use the vocabulary, learn to use the words here because they will better tell us about our state. So I thought it'd be nice just to have those few slides for those of you who aren't familiar with somatic experiencing principles and what we mean by things like the felt sense and so on and so forth. So with that kind of done, I wanted to share a little bit of my story. Now, my story is going to be split up into two sections. I will tell part of my story here, and I will tell part of my story when the section on hijab. Now, you can see there's a picture there, and that actually is from my 40th birthday a few years ago, where for me, I've always been a little bit different in my community, just, generally in my workplace and everywhere I've gone to, I've always felt a little different, and started at the age of 40 to really embrace that difference. And so the quote, "Be a unicorn in a field of horses," kind of provided the theme for how I was going to enter into my 40s. So that will explain to you why I'm dressed like a unicorn in that picture. Color is really important to me. Celebrating difference is also really important to me as well. And I hope that that picture will give you a little bit of a snippet of who I am and my story so far. If we look at this picture board here, I thought it'd be nice to sort of share my story in this format. For me, I grew up in a northern part of United Kingdom, and in a very small town in Lancashire. There wasn't a great deal in terms of number of Muslims or, I would say people of minority background. But growing up, I can't say to you I sort of encountered a great number of Islamophobic or sort of racial or sort of even religious sort of abuse to speak. There was the odd little bit here and there, but to be honest with you, there wasn't a great deal. I didn't grow up in a practicing Muslim family, so the Islam we practiced was more cultural. So my family, my mother, the women folk didn't really wear the head covering. Although it was, we practiced praying and fasting and celebrated Eid, we didn't really kind of do so. It wasn't really until I kind of, entered into my teenage years that I became a bit more interested. And really for me, my experience of, I suppose, Islamophobia sort of began around about the time when I sort of came into adulthood, so to speak. And, I experienced this more so when I first became a midwife. So that first picture at the top there is me as a midwife, and I'd been a midwife for 20 odd years. When I was meeting sort of clientele, I'd moved to a different city, and here now, because people hadn't met many people like me, and there was a lot of sort of, I suppose, those sort of media was painting a bit more of a picture of how Muslims are supposed to be feared, and they're terrorists and so on and so forth. So I kind of met a bit more Islamophobic behavior at that point. But midwifery was where, I suppose, one of the things I learned was that when I would find that pain would actually wasn't pleasant, and I learned not to react to that, but to respond to that with kindness. And so my midwifery, my real life, that when I came across individuals outside the workplace, racial bigotry, I didn't take that personally. I saw, not long after coming to Liverpool to study, and although you see a guy there on the beach, that's not who he was. He's there in the corner. And my husband, actually, when I first met him, was a wonderful individual, and he was already a Muslim, although he himself grew up in a Catholic household and was is white, sort of English man. He converted at the age of 19, so several years before we met, he'd already become Muslim. And it was our sort of union and our travel around the world that shaped sort of, and I suppose in many ways as well, allowed me sort of to see the behavior of others towards myself and behavior of others towards him. And it was here that I really saw this disparity, because prior to being married to him, I assumed that everybody experienced what I did on some level. The prejudices, the microaggressions were things that everyone encountered. But it wasn't until we started traveling and going to different, in Dubai is one of my very first profound sort of, I suppose, prejudices that I'd experienced. We'd gone into a restaurant there and it was filled with expats, and my husband was first to go in, and he was immediately greeted by one of the waiters and taken up to be seated. And I was sort of still seeing to my son. And by the time I'd sort of picked him up and started walking towards where my husband was seated, I was immediately sort of met with this hand gesture of, no, you can't come here. No, you can't go to this space to sit up on this balcony. And I said, what do you mean I can't go here? I'm only just going over there. And it was this real sort of, forceful no. And I could see people around me sort of looking around, but nobody really doing anything. People were whispering, people were talking. And I was starting to get really upset at this point, because I couldn't understand why he'd let my husband go through, but not myself. And it was only when my husband came up and said to the waiter, what are you doing? This is my wife, that he became really apologetic and then was saying sorry. He said, oh, sorry, we didn't think she was with you, and we didn't want her to come trouble you. We thought she was a maid, and she was wanting to sort of, ask you for something or want something from you. And that really stung, it really hurt. And, thereafter, wherever I went, this is one of the things I would experience. In Spain, my husband would have to go in first and check in, and then I would come. Otherwise, we'd be met with, sorry, there's no room here. And, so this was kind of some of the things that I was experiencing. And it wasn't until I sort of star TV show, you can see there, called The Midwife, not Called the Midwife, sorry, One Born Every Minute, that my experience in the public very much changed. Because what that show did was it introduced me to the United Kingdom and to people who watch the show overseas. From there, the way I was received and the reception that I received from just general public was, my goodness, radically different. I went from people saying, not sure if I want you as a midwife when they initially met me. And then, as soon as I sort of efforted to make them feel safe and reassure them, then they were okay and then were apologetic. Now from the get-go, here were people asking for me, oh, we'd like Hannah to look after us. Oh, is Hannah in? Oh, you're the midwife. Yeah. And so literally the entire nation took me on, and they celebrated me and they championed me. And from there, everything changed. And so it was amazing how when people got to see the real me and not just the scarf and not just the sort of brown face, that when they really sort of saw me, they could connect with me, they felt safe with me, then things changed for me. And that's when I realized that that's what I've got to do. I've got to now sort of approach people with this understanding that they don't know me, and what they've been told of me is to be fearful of me, is to not like me, is to see me as someone who's a threat. Then I made it a very important point to make sure that my first point with them is to make them feel safe, is to make them feel as though I wasn't a threat. And I could only do that with kindness, with compassion, and with understanding, and being open and allowing them to come to me and ask me whatever they wanted. So that's my story so far. I'll share some of my story a little bit later. But perhaps now, I can hand it over to Idris, and he can share a little bit more about his story so far. So thank you, guys. I'll just end the screen share here.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I think Hannah's really touched on some really important points there, especially about how to uncouple people's initial fears of the unknown. And that's something that I really wanted to highlight at the beginning. Let me just bring up my presentation. Share. So I really wanted to share this quote from Tony Merry. This is a book he wrote in counseling, in person-centered counseling. Stereotyping happens because it's too complicated to see everything in individual terms. And we need general categories to help us make sense of all the complexities of human life. So stereotyping is something very natural that we do in order to make sense of things when we don't have a real deep understanding of them. We categorize, and that's very much an initial response to dealing with new stimuli. But then this is the problem, but it's not helpful to hang on to stereotypes that prevent us from seeing people as individuals with unique experiences, feelings, and needs, even though they seem to be members of particular groups. And this is like the dehumanizing of people and objectification of people that's so dangerous, no matter what group they come from. And I experienced this when I became Muslim, actually. So I thought we'd start off with just introducing my story. So here I am. I think I'm about 8 years of age there. So I was born into a family from Kent, just southeast of London, and to my dad and my mum, and there was my sister as well, from a very typical white working class background. But the family situation was quite difficult because my father was very distant in the relationship to the rest of the family, very much engrossed in work and in his and football. And so I felt there was something wrong in the family, and I was always quite an unhappy child. And then that's me, not a very deep picture, but there's me as a teenager, where what happened was my parents ended up divorcing. And that was a real, that I'd probably say that's one of the most impactful experiences I had as a youngster, was when my dad left the house when I was around 9 years of age. And then my mother, who had just became a practicing Christian when I was still an infant. But what happened is that once my parents divorced, then my mother remarried within a year to a very devout Christian in the church. And his wife had previously, around the same time of my father divorcing my mother, his wife had died of cancer, and he had 2 children that he had to take care of. So these 2 families came together, these 2 Christian families, and they thought it would really heal the wounds that were in both sides of the families. What ended up happening was 2 teenage boys, you can imagine, is that there was a lot of conflict between me and with my stepbrother and my stepdad, and it became quite volatile. And at the same time, there was a lot of impetus on us to attend church and practice as Christians. And me being a young teenager, rebellious teenager at the time, I was very much opposed to that. And I couldn't really find my place in the church. So I became a bit of an alternative seeker after that. And I really found belonging with my friends. We were just exploring in all sorts and dabbling in all sorts of things. But I became very, very unhappy because I really struggled to find belonging. Ooh, let's see if I can, next slide. So that's what happens next. Is the next part of the story is when I thought the best thing that could happen to me was me to get out of my hometown and get to university. And in the UK at the time, the universities were free. So we would actually get a stipend, and all our education was paid for. So I went to Leeds University, and then, but I was supposed to be studying ancient history there, but I didn't get the grades that I was supposed to because I was mucking around. And and with the grades I had, all they could offer me was 3 things. That was either Chinese, Russian, or Arabic. And I was thinking, what on earth am I going to do with with Chinese, Russian, or Arabic? I was not good at languages at school. And just off the cuff, I said, well, this Arabic, has it got some history element to it? And they said, yes. And I said, well, I'll take the Arabic. And so I ended up at Leeds University, studying Arabic and meeting Muslims for the first time. And it was very interesting. My first reaction to the Muslims, the first thing, there was a number. I moved up north where there's a far greater population of South Asians. And my first impressions of being in the Arabic department, seeing some men with beards, women with scarves on their heads, I said, is this an Amish farmers convention? You know, I was really this was completely out of my comfort zone. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I was scared that the men had sabers and they were going to attack me. But around that time, even though I was doing very badly at Arabic, I had a real life crisis at that point because I was really struggling at the Arabic. And then a friend of mine from back home committed suicide. He hung himself. And that really struck me then, because he was very similar to me, from a broken family. And also he was sort of dibbling and dabbling, trying to find some sense of belonging. And he got himself into so many problems that he felt that the only real solution was to end his life. And so I became deeply desperate and you could say traumatized at the point by that. And I started heavily drinking and just really miserable. It was at that point I actually started asking the Muslims in the department, does your religion give you some sense of peace? And they said yes. So I actually became a Muslim and thought I'd give it a try, not really knowing much about the religion, really, to be honest, at the time. And so I became a Muslim at the local mosque there. And then suddenly I became to flourish at the Arabic, and I felt like I'd been given a new life. I became the top of the class when I was the worst in the class at Arabic. And then I think one of the most powerful experiences for me soon after was that we went to Fez in Morocco for our year abroad to study the language and deepen our understanding of the Arabic language. So you'll see this image here. I actually this is the ancient city of Fez, and you'll see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, there's a green dome right in the far distance with a minaret there. And that is Mawlay Idris, who was the founder of Fez. And I lived actually right by the actual shrine there for around a year. The city is around 1,200 years old. And that was life-changing for me. When I went there, before I even went to the American Language Center there, where we were actually studying, I went on what we could say a 1-month religious program that was being spearheaded by a very famous American Muslim scholar now called Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hanson. And I'm very curious about how your reactions are to seeing this image. Here's me right in the right-hand corner, just going on this this course that was 1-month program in the Qarawiyyin, which is debatably the oldest university in the world. And we were studying with the Moroccan scholars there, and people, men and women, came from Canada, America, and Europe to study there and to sort of bond. And many of these people in this picture actually ended up going to places like Jordan, Syria, Yemen to study. And now presently, they are leaders of Muslim communities throughout the UK. And then interestingly, very passionate about portraying the true message of Islam. None of them became radicalized, and none of them taught hate speech. And so there's me as a young man around 19 years of age, and you could imagine seeing this image. I'm just curious about what comes up in your felt sense, your experience of that. Like, is there fear? Is there concern? Is there trepidation? You'd probably look at that and think it's some sort of a camp in Afghanistan where people are being radicalized, but that wasn't the case. And so I decided after becoming Muslim to go back to Morocco. Now, one interesting point around this was the first sort of experience I had of Islamophobia, which was unintentional Islamophobia, was the concern of my family and my friends. The moment I became Muslim, my family being predominantly quite devout Christians, they really became fearful for me. I remember my stepsister saying, "Do you realize if you leave, they might kill you?" I remember a friend of mine, she said to me, "Does that mean I've got to wear black when I'm around you?" So all sorts of fears were stirred up around them that I don't think you would have got if, for example, if I were to say I converted to Buddhism. People often make this joke. They said, if you had studied Chinese, you would have become a Buddhist. If you had studied Russian, you might become Russian Orthodox. And I don't think there would have been as much concern and fear for me if I had done so. But it's really interesting around the sort of prejudices and the sort of propaganda that's been spread around Islam being a radical religion. So I had to deal with that, and it became really difficult for me because I felt like, even though I didn't know much about the faith at that time, I had to become a spokesman for it. And every time I met with friends and family, I felt a huge pressure on myself in order to sort of have the right answers to quell their fears, which were never quelled. And so that's really when I felt the sort of prejudices against Islam. In Morocco, well, basically from those prejudices and the sense of fear in UK at the time, I ran away to Morocco. So I ended up living in Morocco for the next 6 or 7 years, teaching English and studying Islamic studies at the Qarawiyyin. And this is one image of me and a friend of mine who became a scholar in the US, Sheikh Abdullah bin Ali. And we were actually going to visit friends in the countryside of Morocco, where the only way we could get in and out was on donkey. So that's me as a young Muslim. Then that's another image of me in Morocco with friends, where we were actually part of a spiritual, what can you say? There were friends in the north of Morocco who we all had the same spiritual mentor. So I go visit them frequently in the north of Morocco. So that's me in traditional Moroccan garb. And then I came back, when I was about 29, I came back, and this is me this is actually a Turkish jacket with English dress. And I ended up becoming a Muslim leader in the community. Now, one thing that I found coming back, how I would often become really conscious of people seeing me as a Muslim. And so you'll notice it was very easy for me to hide my Muslim identity. And I think that's probably the real struggle I had is like, when I meet with different people, what is it that I can actually talk about? What topics can I raise? What things can I speak about, and what impact that will have on them? And I was very much conscious of making people feel calm and making people feel relaxed. And so I think that's the major experience of Islamophobia that I experienced in my life, is just this constant awareness of my impact. But then I think I experienced it more directly. This is my wife, Sarah. I got married to Sarah, who's from Glasgow. And this is us actually in Ireland on a trip. And what I really experienced there was, you know, an English man with an Asian woman wearing scarf, the sort of looks that we would get publicly, and the stares we would get from people. And often from people, you'll get the sense that people weren't very happy. People were very uncomfortable around us. So that's the other sort of experience of Islamophobia that I personally was exposed to, being married to an Asian. So here's my sort of collage of my journey. And I'm just curious what comes up for people when they see that. Like when you see this young boy around 8 years old and this journey, like what sort of emotional roller coaster was it for you, seeing these different, sort of transitions that I went through to where I am today, teaching in the Muslim community, and also supporting them in a pastoral role. So that's my story. I'm just going to see what the next part. I think we go straight into, yeah, what is Islam? So just a brief presentation now. And what is Islam then? You know, when we talk about Islamophobia, what does it fundamentally mean? It's either a fear of a hatred towards Islam. And so what we find is so many people, even though they don't have much knowledge about Islam necessarily, within the US and within Europe, they do definitely have an emotional response to Islam. And so despite not necessarily knowing much about it, we harbor strong feelings about it. And the media functions as the most powerful and influential conveyor of that, you know, of our response to Islam. So I think the first step in combating Islam is really to try to understand what it is, but from the actual proponents, from the actual people who practice this religion, rather than taking it from people who aren't part of the faith, who profess to be experts, but are very antagonistic in their delivery of what Islam is. So we know that Islam is around the 1.6 billion people around the world are Muslims. And we see on this map where Islam is most, you know, where Muslims are most populated. So we see Africa. We will see, obviously, people would assume that it'd be Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and then we'll see Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, but also into the Russian, the you know, the territories of Russia, like Dagestan and Chechnya, and even into Russia itself as a country. Over 10% of the population is actually Muslim. And then we will see Indonesia, and Indonesia actually has the largest Muslim population in the world. And as well as India, obviously India, Bangladesh and Pakistan and Afghanistan together, they are very, very large. There's a very, very large collection of Muslims there. But we also see very large, probably less obvious, large representation in countries like in Suriname and in Guyana, that we see a large Muslim population there in South America. And that comes from Indonesians and Indians coming over in the 18th and 19th century as slaves and as workers, and ending up being a large number of the population there. So you'll see also that in China, as you'll know, with the recent coverage of the conflicts there with the Uyghur Muslims, there's a very large percentage of a very large number of Chinese Muslims as well. And these Muslims are in China, in Russia, they're not new to the country. In fact, they've been there in China from 8th century and in Russia as well from 8th century onwards. We also know that historically, much of Spain was actually Muslim as well. So I just wanted to show you some images of how Islam is not a monolithic sort of culture that's just one. It's very different, and it's very expressed very differently depending on the country where it's practiced. So we see here in China, this is traditional Chinese mosques. You see they very much blend into the actual the geography of the country. And then we also see, here's a mosque. This is a new mosque in Russia that Vladimir Putin's opening. You can see his image right at the bottom. I'm assuming that's Vladimir Putin in that video there. So this is a Russian mosque. And I just wonder what comes up for you when you see that, is that the first thing I see of that is it looks very, very much like a Russian Orthodox church. We also see, here's a new mosque in Granada. I think it was established around maybe 10, 15 years ago. That's beautifully on the other side of the Alhambra. So the Alhambra, which is a famous Muslim castle that's in Granada, you'll see this mosque on the other side of the Alhambra. So you can actually, with your back to the mosque, you see the Alhambra right across from it. And again, you'll see how it blends into the traditional Spanish Andalusian architecture there, and you see the beautiful gardens as well. Now, I wonder what comes up for you when you see this. So what I wanted to be a bit provocative here is, here we see an image that we might associate with Iran. And now I'm just gonna shift this. This is Iranian architecture. So I just wondered what the shift was for you on seeing these two very different and contrasting images. You know, when you see this architecture, you see the beauty and the intricacy and the sophistication of the culture. And then when we see these images that are very common for us to see in the media around Iran, suddenly there's a very different response. So it's really important for us when we hear, for example, the name Iran, what comes up for us in our felt experience. And that's very much reinforced by the channels where we receive information about this place. But if we were to actually go visit the country, we would get a very different experience of it depending on our experiences in the country. And so here we see some of the most beautiful architecture that I'm aware of. It's phenomenal, the architecture in Iran. And then we see, here's an image of Osama bin Laden. And I'm curious what comes up for you. And then we've got Rumi, which, here you go, a man with a turban and a beard. And him saying, when you let go of who you are, you become who you might be. And we might find that to be a very profound statement, but that's very much what Islam means. So what does Islam mean? Islam fundamentally comes from the word salam. And what does salam mean? Salam means, it's usually translated as peace, but it doesn't fundamentally mean that. It's a nuance, it's a secondary meaning to the word salam. And salam actually means to be whole whereby you need nothing else. And so Islam actually is quite complex, as it means, Islam means to actively give yourself over to something larger than yourself. And in that you find peace. And this is very much captured in this quote by Rumi: when you let go of who you are, you become who you might be. So when you surrender to something bigger, you discover who you really are. But interestingly, obviously Islam fundamentally means to surrender. But that, even when we say the term surrender, I'll be curious about what comes up for you, because you can get two very different responses even to that term word surrender. Surrender might be, I have to give up things. Surrender means I'm going to be taken over by something, and choice is going to be removed for me. But then surrender can almost mean that you open up to something larger, to feel something greater than yourself, and feel this almost release. So even that word surrender, when we talk about Islam, people can portray a very different image of that, what Islam means. And so fundamentally, it means wholeness. And you'll notice that Muslims, just like the Jews, they have shalom from a very similar, well, it's from the same root. So we say assalamu alaikum as a greeting, and that fundamentally means we can draw different meanings from that word assalamu alaikum. It can just mean peace be upon you, or it can mean that I show my whole self to you, that I'm being genuine with you, and you've got nothing to fear. Obviously, it's a name of God as well. Salam is one of the names of God in Islam, and it means to be whole and not needing to be, not needing anything other. And so salam can mean may God be upon you, protecting you. And so these are the meanings of Islam and the root meaning of salam. When we talk about the Middle East today, the Middle East is, we talk about something that's very important for us, is that even our perceptions of the Middle East can be very, very different. And so from a Judeo-Christian background, the Middle East, we might conjure up images of, the Holy Lands. But for also politically, we might associate Saudi Arabia with it, the Gulf states. So, but fundamentally, we see that the Middle East is an area that's shared by three different cultures that actually have so much in common, and had a huge impact on Europe and America in terms of religion. So we often talk about the Judeo Christian culture, but these three cultures are very much enmeshed and influenced by one another. So when Islam, starting in Mecca, in what's now known as Saudi Arabia, it spread very quickly throughout the Middle East and then into Africa, to the lengths of Spain, to China. It had a huge impact, and it was hugely impacted by the local cultures. It interacted with different cultures, from Hindus to Buddhists, to Christianity, to Judaism, to Zoroastrianism that was in Iran at the time. And all of these cultures had a great impact on one another and influenced one another. And so when we talk about Judeo-Christian tradition and culture and civilization, really, I think it's fair to say that Europe is very much a Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization. Why is that? Because what happened historically is that the Muslims, just like the Christians and the Jewish traditions, they ended up merging Aristotle and Socrates and so forth. And they had to see how they could integrate Greco-Hellenistic philosophy with their tradition. And all three religions really sought and efforted how to do that. And Islam, through people like Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who was in what we know now today's Iran or Afghanistan. And then we've got Ibn Rushd, Averroes, who was in Spain. They took Hellenistic philosophy and developed it to show that religion and science and traditional philosophy were not actually in conflict with one another, but rather they actually complemented one another. And those traditions very much impacted Europe today. They impact by impacting the thoughts of Thomas Aquinas, by impacting the thoughts of Maimonides from the Muslim Jewish tradition. And really interestingly is that I lived in Fez for 6-7 years, and Maimonides had a house there, and my friends actually live in that house. And I remember the old man who's now passed away, he would mention how the Jewish community, because they had a large Jewish community in Fez traditionally, would come down on the Sabbath, and they would come to his house, and he was a young boy, and they would put him on their shoulders in order to light a candle in a little niche of the house, just outside on the external wall of their house. Every the Sabbath, they would come down and they would put him on their shoulders, who was a Muslim boy, to light the candle. And Maimonides was a student of Ibn Rushd of Averroes, and became the physician of who we know in Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, or Saladin as he's known in Europe. And so we see these three cultures had a deep connection with one another, and they interacted with one another. And of course, that was from time to time throughout history, there was conflicts, but there was also a huge respect, and there was a huge sharing of different cultures. So this idea that Islam is the antithesis, it's the sort of, it's a clash of civilizations between a Judeo-Christian tradition and Islamic tradition, is a complete false idea that's been conjured up for political reasons in our current climate that I'm going to talk about later. I think that's, yeah, so something I just wanted to, I'm not sure about time, I lose track. So quickly, I just wanted to talk about some things that we can appreciate from the Muslim tradition, is that this idea of embodiedness, the embodied practice of the 5 daily prayers. So Muslims, what do we do when we practice our prayer? You'll see these gentlemen praying in public and the woman walking behind curious about what's going on. The Muslim prayer is very much connected to the elements. When the sun rises, when the sun falls, and its position in the sky. And it's also very much connected to our environment, because we navigate towards Mecca when we pray. So we have to almost orient when we're praying and get a sense of our direction. And you'll know that from somatic principles, this is very healing for people to almost have a sense of orientation, to feel grounded in their bodies. And so the Muslim prayer is very much a powerful reminder that spirituality is as much in the body as it is in ideas and in the soul. Another powerful thing is a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, where he very much expressed some somatic principles here. When his son, his infant son was passing away in his arms, he started crying, and people asked him, you know, is this not contradictory to spirituality, that you shouldn't be affected by these situations? And he expressed, the eye sheds tears, the heart feels pain, but we do not say anything except what pleases our Lord. And this is very powerful somatically, because notice he identified physiologically with his grief, then emotionally with his grief, and he put cognition to the side. Because if we're going through grief, we know now neuroscientifically that our cognition is impaired when we're overwhelmed emotionally. And so if we try to understand things when we're emotionally dysregulated, we can often misunderstand things. And so it's very important that in order for us to process things, we don't have to process things cognitively. Rather, it's far more important when we're overwhelmed to process things physiologically. The eye sheds tears, the heart feels grief, the actual emotionally. And then once we've done that, things will make sense to us. We'll have a greater, more broader perspective of why events have happened in our life. And another powerful tradition in the Islamic tradition, I remember when Peter Levine introduced to, I became aware of the VU technique of stabilizing oneself or bringing oneself out of shutdown states. He would do this guttural VU. And I realized, just as like in the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition with the Om tradition, we have this in the Islamic tradition in the way that we actually invoke God's name. So this is in Arabic calligraphy. We say Allah, Allah. So you'll notice very, very similar that we're stimulating the vagus nerve, and that's going to take us on to, there's other things I was going to share, but we have to leave. This was quickly, that is Islam really something antithetical to the US? If you'll notice in America, we've actually got many towns that are named after Muslim names. So Mecca in California, Baghdad in Florida, Al Qadir in Iowa, which is actually named after Amir Abdul Qadir, who was actually a man that in Algeria fought to expel the French protectorate from his country. We've got Medina in Iowa, and we've actually even got Muhammad in Illinois. So is Islam really something strange? Because we know that over 30% of the slaves that came over were actually Muslims. So I will stop there and hand it over to Hannah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Andrew. That was absolutely wonderful listening to you share all of those things, and I was nodding profusely at points. What I wanted to do now, as we move on from what is Islam, as we move into a few more sort of exercise-based sort of sharings here, Andrew and I thought it'd be good for me again to be able to sort of share here now a little bit about the vagus nerve, just as we move into sort of a little bit more of the body when we talk about things like Islamophobia and historically how that came about, that as he's going to go on and share some of the sort of knowledge and information on that, we thought in a more felt sense, more embodied sense, it'd be interesting for you guys to learn a little bit about how some of our experiences in the body actually do arise. Now, this picture that you see here on the right-hand side is an image of the vagus nerve. Now, we know the vagus nerve to be one of the sort of 12 cranial nerves, but this particular nerve here is oftentimes sometimes referred to as the soul nerve or the wandering nerve. And what's important about this particular nerve is, particularly when you read about it in the polyvagal theory, is that it regulates what we call our breathing, our heart rate, our blood pressure. It's what helps to prevent inflammation. It can improve our mood, manage fear. It's also involved in intimacy, in how safe we feel and how our body interacts with others, interacts with the environment, and how also this particular nerve is also responsible for storing or memory making, if we want to call it that. And as you can see, it comes out of the sort of bottom of the brainstem area. It wraps around the heart and lung, around the digestive organs. So when we do go into a state of fight and flight, you'll notice how you'll become very aware of your heart rate increasing, and you feel more energized in your hands and feet, either ready to sort of fight what's in front of you or literally take flight. Or likewise, sometimes how in a state of freeze, how you may notice the body shuts down. And again, we're going to look at how this particular sort of nerve in the body responds, okay, as we experience things on a day-to-day basis. Now, one of the things that we know is when we're coming into this world as babies, as someone who's been a midwife and watched and counted and actually caught, thousands of babies with my own hand, one of the things that I've seen pretty much from the get-go is this need and this want to connect. You'll see sort of the baby as it comes out of the womb sort of looking around, and we're all born with this affinity for the human face. We're already connecting from conception. We see the mother's heartbeat is the first stimuli for the growth of this sort of embryo. And so it's no different when the baby now emerges out of the womb. We come into this world really hardwired to connect. And with our first breath, we really embark upon this quest to feel safe in our bodies. You see how babies need soothing, they need rocking, and they need shushing, because what that does is it calms their nervous system. So when we look at our environments and our relationship to our environment, here now the vagus nerve becomes really important. The autonomic nervous system can be regarded as our personal surveillance system. It's always on guard. It's always asking that question, am I safe? Is this safe? So here, when we sort of understand it from this perspective, we can really begin to see that the goal here is to protect us by sensing safety and risk and listening moment by moment to what is happening around us and what is happening inside of our bodies, and how sort of we can use this in connection to others. Do I feel safe in this moment, or do I feel mobilized, or is there something going on that's so overwhelming and my sort of body's become immobilized? So this sort of listening that takes place by the vagus nerve, this observational sort of looking around the surveillance system, it happens below our conscious awareness. This happens in it's part of that subconscious makeup, and it's far away from our conscious control. So our autonomic nervous system is always it's scanning, it's looking for cues of safety or danger. Is my life at threat here? And it's doing this without really involving that sort of more thinking rational part of our brains. So in that way, we human beings are quite meaning making, where we're always sort of trying to put a story to the state, so to speak. And so, you know, we'll talk about neuroception in a few moments, but when Andrew brought up some of those images earlier, and you saw those beautiful architecture, and you saw pictures of, you know, those sort of people in Iran, the Muslims in Iran, you can really begin to see how here there may have been moments of sort of expansion and contraction, but that's also based on our experience and also what we've been fed. You know, as babies, we come into this world with only really two fears: fear of being left alone and the fear of falling. So everything else is kind of come into our being through experience and what we're taught. And many occasions when I see the depiction of Muslims in the media, and I see what people now sort of regard Muslims as, is often these fearful group of people who want to take over our countries, who want to take over our culture, who want to eradicate, you know, sort of English, American, Western culture and put forward Sharia law. And this is what I hear all the time when I begin conversations with people who are not Muslim. And so can you imagine when the media bombards us with these images, it's oftentimes adding the word terrorist, adding the word threat, adding the word Sharia. And so these have now been sort of understood and felt by the body as something negative. And when we now, even myself, when I walk down the street post 9/11, because of the amount of times I've seen someone who covers their face or a man with a big beard has been sort of really vilified and demonized, I too feel in a felt sense like, oh my gosh, like she's got her face covered. And, you know, because we know the human face is so important in feeling safety, that when we look at somebody's eyes and look at somebody's mouth, there's a safety that comes in when we're met with a smile. So I wanted to just share those two things so you understand that, you know, there's this surveillance system, this vagus nerve that is always working underneath the radar, that has been collecting data since we were born from our 5 senses, that is telling us whether something is safe or not safe. And so here the media has a responsibility, society has a responsibility, that when we see a group of people being marginalized or being spoken of in a way that is untrue, and there's a lot of falsehoods there, that we need to stand up and we need to speak out against that. Or we as Muslims also need to show that actually that is not us. And that's the, I suppose, reason why we're here today, to talk about such things on this platform. So I thought, Idris, you know, if you could go on to the next exercise, hopefully these 2 slides will feed into what Idris wants to do with us next.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Yeah. Oh, what's happened there? Oh, excuse me here. Don't know how that's disappeared. Excuse my messy desktop. Where has it gone? That is really strange. There's my Islamophobia presentation gone. Where has it gone? Bear with me. If everyone can help me find it amongst the best of my desktop. That is really strange.
If you go and if you type in the title, there we go.
Oh, just a minute. I'll open. There you go.
Okay, great.
We got there.
We found it.
Yeah, something else I forgot to actually mention in that What is Islam was the actual what Islam fundamentally believes. And it's this concept of fitra, F-I-T-R-A. And fitra means a sort of the primordial nature of the human being. And from an Islamic point of view, the human being has a nature towards reaching out to something divine and the oneness of God. And so from an Islamic perspective, it has the same prophets as the Jews and the Christians. And they were that all the prophets from Adam all the way up to the last prophet Muhammad, that they were teaching this one message of oneness of God and connecting to God. And that's very important. We appreciate that the Jewish and the Christian and the Islamic traditions are very much rooted in a very similar world view of the world and the view of history, of that there was prophets that came to people to connect them back to this oneness of God. And from an Islamic perspective, we view that that Muhammad was the last and final one of those to connect people to this tradition. Now, what is Islamophobia? So I'm going to be a little bit provocative here, is that how does Islamophobia really impact the Muslims in a way that they feel like they're always on edge and they have to sort of defend themselves, like I was saying in my presentation about my story. And one thing is, what I want to do here by being a bit provocative is to turn the tables and feel, for example, how would American feel if someone presented American history like this? So I'm just going to skip through all of these. Here we go. So I want you to, to be curious about your sort of responses to these. So if we were to say, why is the white American so violent and why does he hate us so much? So this is what we often hear about Muslims. Why is the Muslim so violent and why does he hate us so much? And you'll say, what do you mean of white Americans? They're not violent. And then we'd say, well, in 1492, an estimated 16 million indigenous people lived in the continent of the United States. By 1900, only 237,000 natives were left. That's a depopulation rate of 98.4% in the span of 4 centuries. Now, I'm just curious about when I share these things, what comes up in you? Some people may become defensive. Some people may, well, you're twisting the story, but it's very easy for us to portray an image of a certain people being violent and being filled with hate. Why is the white American so violent and why does he hate us so much? Between 16th century to the 19th century, millions of Africans were enslaved and died at the hands of Americans. Why is the white American so violent and why does he hate us so much? In 1945, the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing approximately 263,000 people. Why is the white American so violent and why does he hate us so much? Between US involvement in Vietnam from 1955 to 73, over 2 million Vietnamese civilians died. And I'm being very provocative with that image there. Why is the white American so violent and why does he hate us so much? Between 2003 to 2019, 200,000 Iraqi civilians have died from the US-led war. And then bringing it into the modern day, imagine if I were to just paint this picture and say, this is a representation of white Americans. So this month, white Americans stormed the US Senate to stop the inauguration of the democratically elected new president. Why is it that white Americans are so violent and why do they hate us so much? And you'll see that image and that could be very, very frightening to someone depending how it's portrayed. And so what I really wanted to do in that exercise was to show how easy it is to portray a people as full of hate and a source of fear for us. And it becomes very difficult for us to, especially as a minority, to dismiss these fears and these claims made at us. And this leads us into the next topic of what's the historical reasons for Islamophobia. So historically, Islam was seen very early on. We'd say probably 7th century up to the 11th century. In terms of Europe, Islam was seen as an external threat to preserving Western empires and nations. It was always seen back then and even today as a religious political rival. Europe combated Islam through polemics and aggression. Now, this wasn't necessarily the case with Christians and Jews within the Middle East, but it definitely was the case with Europe because Europe wasn't very well connected to the Muslim world at the time. It wasn't until the Crusades in the 11th to the 13th century that the Europeans really started to become exposed and interacted with Muslims. And before that, they had this idea that Muslims were a polytheistic, idol-worshipping people. And they got the shock of their lives when they turned up as crusaders. And obviously, that's a very dark part of our history, of our world history. But Europeans were finally able to get a true idea to some degree of what Islam was. Then 13th to 17th century, we see the Europeans or the Christian Europeans taking back Spain. So we have the Spanish Reconquista, where we have Jews and Muslims being persecuted and then eventually fully expelled from Spain. And much of the Jewish community came to North Africa in Morocco and in Algeria, and many of them went to Turkey. And we still have a lot, I wouldn't say a large community, but there still is a presence of the Jewish community there in Morocco. I met a number of Moroccan Jews that now lived in Israel, but you'll see in the summer they would come over to visit their heritage in Morocco. Then we see 15th century, Constantinople falls to the Ottomans, the Turks in the 15th century. This created real bad blood between the Roman Catholic Church, because Constantinople was seen as the capital of the Roman Catholic Church at the time. And then we have the Ottomans actually reaching Vienna, Hungary, and Greece. And so throughout the medieval period, we see this sense of they are the other and they are the enemy, the Muslim, and they're the outsider. Unlike the Jewish community that was still probably, that had a small presence within Europe, so they were actually in Europe, there was very little interaction with Muslims within society. And so it was very much outside and demonized as the other. That is a force to be reckoned with, and there was constant competition between Europe and the Muslim world at the time. We see a slight shift in attitudes in Europe towards Muslims with the Enlightenment period. The 17th to 18th century, we see there's actually, as there was a more moving away from Christianity by many intellectuals, the intelligentsia, they had a greater interest in the study of Arabs and Islam, especially medicine, in terms of medicine, and in terms of science. And so at this point, it's an interesting period in European history, is the intelligentsia tended to stress universalism and tended to stress commonalities between human beings. And many of them had a very favorable attitude towards Muslims. It wasn't until colonial periods, 18th century up into the 20th century, where there was a shift in terms of Muslims as being seen as backward and Muslims being inferior to the superior European culture, as Britain, France, and Netherlands established colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And then scholars and politicians depicted West as superior, and more civilized than the Muslim world. So many Muslims in the Middle East and in other Muslim majority regions blame their political and economic struggles today on the past as well as present interference from the West. So as these colonial powers came in and they asserted themselves and started to take advantage of the resources of those Muslim countries, and then even after leaving those Muslim countries, still very much having a hold on their economy, this is where we see a real sort of resentment, you could say, in the Muslim world towards many of the colonial powers. And hence this is really the emergence of many of the Muslim world feeling a sense of suspicion and fear and resentment towards European powers at the time. Then we see, with after World War I and then into World War II, with the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union, there becomes a very different attitude. The America now steps in, and before that, there was the Muslim world generally had a favorable attitude towards the United States, to the extent that Morocco was one of the first countries to acknowledge America's independence. And Islam was seen in a generally favorable light, not in the antagonistic way that we see it today. And so the Middle East had a favorable view of the US, believing it to be largely a benevolent nation, lacking any imperialistic designs. They saw the US as a symbol of hope and a model for democracy and freedom, especially once, because many of the Muslim countries, overwhelming majority of Muslim countries, were actually trying to seek independence from European colonial powers. There became a real shift the US grew in its influence in the world, especially in the Middle East and the resources, and there became a conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. And so there becomes because of the vital travel and trade routes connecting east to west, and the Middle East containing expansive oil and energy reserves, there became a real fight between the Soviet Union and the US. And we see very interestingly, with the Afghani war, the American government taking having a favorable a favorable opinion and supporting the Taliban at the time, and seeing the Soviets as the enemies and the Afghani Taliban as freedom fighters defending their lands. Isn't it really interesting how a certain period of history, depending on the politics of the time and the economic interests, the image of a people will very much be relevant, so be conditioned on what's going on economically and politically. And then we see in 1948 the creation of the State of Israel, and the war that followed. Many Arab Muslims view this as a continuation of Western colonial power. So with Israel, the establishment of Israel now, there became it really shook the Muslim and the Arab world specifically at the time, and it really sort of had an influence on the Muslim and Arab attitude towards the US at the time. Then we see in 1953, the CIA conspired with the MI6 to back a coup that led to the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected prime minister, who wanted to nationalize the petroleum resources, and US supported the Shah, who undermined democracy. And this led eventually to the Iranian Revolution. That really, I think, that's when there was a real propaganda against this sort of in Islam that was radical. Then we see the Soviet-Afghan War in 1979 to 1989 that I spoke about. But that even then, it wasn't until 1990 that was a major shift in the attitude in the US towards Muslims and the Muslim world and the Arab world. And that was really by Bernard Lewis. He repackaged Orientalism for the American foreign policy by making the claim that Islam and the West are involved in a clash of civilizations. He published a paper in 1990 titled The Roots of Muslim Rage. He inspired Samuel P. Huntington, a professor of government at Harvard, and Islam was now the new enemy. Now the Soviet Union had collapsed. Islam was now the new enemy, replacing the Soviet Union. And this theory has been instrumental in defining foreign policy since 9/11, with the tragic with the tragic event of the Twin Towers and the deaths that followed, and then subsequently the deaths that followed in Iraq. So we see that the attitudes to Islam and the Muslim world is not really a religious thing. It's a geopolitical and economical thing that that defines how we see a people. And I think we will stop the share there. So over to you, Hannah.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. It was really another interesting segment there by yourself. Now, we're moving on to, well, if I can, let me just get this in place. Sorry, one moment, bear with me. If we can now, what we wanted to do was kind of, we've spoken a little bit there about what Islam is, how Muslims came to be sort of demonized, how Islamophobia sort of had its origins. But we wanted to move back to a little bit more of a personal story now, if I can. And earlier on, when we first started, one of the things that we did was we started off by sharing our stories. And, as Idris was saying, Islam's not monolithic, in that there are so many different cultures and so many different races that come together to form the Islamic body. And, when I speak about the hijab here, I'm speaking about it more so from my own personal experience. I don't claim in any way to say that my experience and what I've sort of endured as a result of wearing the hijab is what every Muslim woman does, but certainly there'll be some universal truths here. one of the things I wanted to do as I sort of, talk about the hijab is I wanted to kind of incorporate a little bit of a more embodied kind of experience in this presentation too. So here, we see there's an image there of a female with her head covered, and a lot of the time, we really see the fabric, we see the veil before we see anything else, and we don't understand what it is that this veil represents. Here I've put together a little collage because I think oftentimes when we hear the word Muslim woman, the stereotype that comes to mind is this woman dressed in black head to toe. People oftentimes assume that she's a homemaker and that she has lots and lots and lots of babies. And certainly even in my midwifery job, when a Muslim woman would come in, and she would be somebody who perhaps was having her third and fourth babies, because, again, within an Islamic sort of understanding, family and children are seen as blessings, and so encouraged to have large families. That doesn't mean that all cultures and societies will do this, but generally speaking, Muslims do have larger families. But one of the things I think that people would do is they would, do a grave, make a grave mistake here in assuming that that's all that the sort of Muslim woman is. And if you only sort of view her in that stereotype, then, you kind of really miss out on some of the joys that, you would encounter when you meet a Muslim woman. When we look at that picture there, honestly, I'm filled with, like so much joy when I look at that picture. I get this real sense of expansion and this feeling of upliftment as I look at these images. We've got Muslim women in all spheres of life. There's a Muslim woman there as a ballerina. You see a Muslim woman there in service, a Muslim woman there in sport, a Muslim woman there in medicine, Muslim women there in popular culture. That actually Muslim women are everywhere. And, if we are just able to sort of look beyond the stereotypes, and if we are to feel a little braver and be a bit more courageous and actually go up to the Muslim woman and begin a dialogue, then what you'll be met with and what you'll find is the complete opposite of how we've been portrayed oftentimes in the media, in the news, and what people think of us in society. And it really hurts me sometimes when I see that when I walk down a street or I walk into a building, that person shows fear upon their face, or there's this kind of a little bit of sort of cowering that you'll see, or I'm not quite sure if I feel safe in the presence of that person. And one of the first things I do, and perhaps a lot of other people will be able to relate to this, I go into the mode of efforting and wanting to make them feel safe, wanting to make them feel okay, that I don't come as a threat, that I come here, in peace. I come here with love, with compassion, of wanting to connect from one human being to another, that, my hopes and dreams and aspirations are no different to yours. And so, when we look at the hijab here, for me, it beautifies a person rather than takes away from them. It doesn't sort of make them a threat. It doesn't make them now someone to be wary of and fearful of. I've put this here, taken this line from Michael Jackson's song, The Way You Make Me Feel, because one of the things I wanted to do now, you've heard me talk about sensations, thoughts, and feelings as separate entities to us that we can observe and we can become aware of. What I want to do now is I really want to bring up a set of images, and I would love for you guys, if you can, just to be able to put the mind to one side for a moment, or utilize the mind if you can, to just really go into the sort of body, into that more felt sense, that felt sort of experience, and be able to tell me, how does your body respond to the next set of images that I show on the screen? So I want you to ask, your body this question: how does this image of you make me now feel? And I want you to bring in, remember our vagus nerve has been that surveillance system. So every time it's seen a Muslim woman or it's encountered an image of a Muslim woman, it's been told to be wary or be fearful of this particular individual. So let me first and foremost bring up, oh, sorry, one second before we go there. I want to just come into this one here. Sorry, I put the slide in the wrong place. I want to sort of get you in this moment here to look at this image on the screen there. So this is a beautiful young lady called Malika. She's a dear friend's daughter who's agreed to be my model for this. So when you look at Malika here, you know, and as I've already said to you, that human beings, you know, we've got social brains, we're social creatures, we're hardwired to want to connect. When you look at Malika, what is the sense in the body here? What is it that you feel? What is it that you sort of experience, you know, as you look at this face, as you look at her like this? Just take a moment and see what comes up for you. And please feel free to share in the chat box if you like, what it is that you're sensing, feeling, or thinking as you look at this image here. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up another image. And this time, Malika is wearing a hijab, a covering. How does your experience of her change as you see her this time? So earlier on, you saw her without the hijab or the covering on her head. Rather, it was around her neck. It's moved a couple of inches now, and it's now on her head. So as you see it on her head, what is it that you now feel or sense in your body as you encounter Malika like this? Her facial expression is the same. But how do you experience her now with the veil on her head? If I now bring up the second image, we're currently living through a pandemic, and one of the guidelines suggested by the government, by the health officials, is that by wearing a facial surgical mask, we can reduce, you know, the sort of spread or the rate of, you know, infection. So now how do we experience Malika here? This time, not just with a hijab on her head, but now with part of her face being covered. What's the felt sense here? How do we experience Malika when we see her like this? What would we think? What would we feel if we met her walking down the street or perhaps in the market? Because now quite a lot of her face is hidden. We can still see the eyes. What's the felt sense here? And finally, the fourth image that I want to bring up, which is how Muslim women are often portrayed as women covered head to toe in black. And again, remember I said to you that we have this affinity for the human face. So we look at the eyes and the mouth as a place of feeling safe. A neutral face to us in activation comes across as an angry face. So if I'm already feeling quite fearful when I meet you and I don't see a smile on your face, I'm going to be even more wary. So here now we can't see a mouth, but we can certainly see eyes still. But what does it feel like in the body now? What do we think and what do we understand when we see this image of Malika, who's only now just showing her eyes? And there's no right or wrong answer, but I'm just curious to see what are people's experiences and how does the story and the narrative shift from the first picture to now the fourth one? Because Malika is still Malika. Her joys, her hopes, her aspirations, her dreams are the same, whether she's got that scarf on her head or whether, you know, she's uncovered. But what is it that we've been told? What is that story? What is the state that we bring when we meet Malika in the first image compared to Malika in the second, the third, and the fourth? And here, this is really important because, you know, one of the things I wanted to kind of bring your attention to, if I can, is just this slide here that, you know, again, a part of the polyvagal theory is something called the neuroception. And this is where our subconscious system detects threat and safety, okay? And it does so without really our awareness. It doesn't involve that sort of, you know, the neocortex, the thinking part of our brain. So it doesn't, you know, ask the logical, more rational part of us. It connects more with the other parts of the brain. So here there's this sort of, you know, detection without awareness. And neuroception I suppose in many ways, you know, is where as soon as I walk into a place, the sense, you know, the smell, the sight, the sound are all now telling me whether I'm feeling safe, whether I'm feeling danger. So, you know, when we looked at those images of Malika earlier before, what's actually occurring inside of the body? You know, what is it externally? You know, sometimes I know when I used to walk into a place like a restaurant in a part of the country where perhaps there are very few minority people or Muslim people there, then as I walked in, I would immediately see the whole room go quiet. And one person would look at me and they would be unsure of, oh my gosh, like, who's she and what is she doing here? And then I would see them just slowly sort of scanning and orienting around the room. And that would then invite me to look around the room likewise to see, is everybody else doing the same thing? And so now, look at what's happening in the environment around you, between the people. So now even yourself, when you've come across something that is a phobia, what's occurring in the body? What's occurring in the environment around you? And what do you notice occurring between the two people? You know, so in this moment, I want to know, like, how does your neuroception sense me? How is it that your internal system changes your physiology, changes your biochemistry, you know, changes your psychology? And in doing so, you know, how is it now that you view me? Am I something that's seen as a restorative resource, or am I now a threat? You know, what are the cues of safety that you're looking for, or the cues of danger that you're looking for, you know, at this moment in your environment, at this moment as you connect with the other? And one of the things that I started doing and began doing here was, when I would see somebody feeling a little bit frightened or fearful, I would start speaking to show them that I had an English accent. I would smile. I would say, oh, isn't the weather lovely? And I would do things that would bring back a sense of safety in their system. You know, and those are some of the things that I can do to make the other person comfortable. But likewise, also, I invite, you know, the other, whoever that might be, to also have a sense of self-accountability. That is also on you to do the work, for you to go and look at whether or not, is this really the case? Are Muslim people really this dangerous? You know, and when we talk about some of the solutions later on, I hope that you can invite yourself and feel safe and brave enough to be able to go out and perhaps encounter Muslims and go up to them and ask them questions and be curious and intrigued. You know, we have this famous British detective called Sherlock Holmes. And whenever I'm beginning any kind of somatic experiencing work with them, you know, one of the things that I really love about Sherlock is his ability to be endlessly curious and fascinated and intrigued by what he's sort of meeting in his murder investigations. You know, he never jumps into, oh, my goodness, there's a dead body there, you know, but this endless curiosity brings this fascination. And it's that curiosity that will allow us to connect and attach. It's the curiosity and intrigue that will help us sort of learn about each other and find intrigue and mystery and joy and love and compassion between one another, you know. And I think this is really important as I move into sort of sharing a little bit more of my story. So as earlier on, I shared a little bit about sort of how I've come to be where I am, but I wanted to personally share my own story of my sort of hijab. So as I mentioned, I'm not somebody who grew up in a religious family, so to speak. My family are South Asian, and you know, my parents practiced, you know, sort of Ramadan, and they prayed, but there wasn't like a really sort of strong sort of Islamic presence in the household. But in my teenage years, you know, sort of when I was around about 14, 15, I sort of made friends with this lovely girl whose house I went back to, obviously, as you did on play dates and sort of sleepovers. And when I went to her home, I met her mother. And her mother was a white English woman who'd actually converted to Islam. And it was this lady that really inspired me with her daughters to revisit my faith. And they became a very core and central part of my sort of reconnection with Islam at this point. So I spent the whole of sort of, my 14th and 15th year, and it was around about my 16th birthday, the whole summer, I sort of pondered over and mulled over sort of now this real commitment that I wanted to make sort of to my faith. And so I decided that I was going to start wearing the veil. And my gosh, was I in for a surprise? I remember coming down first day of college with a hijab on my head and literally seeing my mother's face, turn a shade of pale, and just was like, what are you doing? Because to her, her reaction there was one of fear. Because what she was saying to me is, Hannah, you can't do this. You can't wear this, because if you do, then you will be unfortunately marginalized, and there will be prejudices that you will come across, and there'll be a lessening of options, and you're not going to be successful, and you won't succeed because you won't fit in, and they won't accept you. And this is what I was met with. So you can imagine I'm disappointed here at this point. But what my mother was trying to point out here is that she felt that sort of, I suppose, objectification, that so often women meet, and whether it's that they're objectified in a sexual sense or whatever. But here, there was this real sort of pull towards, you'll be judged on your aesthetics rather than your skills and your merit. And this is the one thing that I became so defiant in, and saying, no, I will not allow someone to judge me or sort of take me just based on the way that I looked. And so in that moment, I had to really sort of think, what is it that I wanted to do? How is it that I wanted to sort of move forward with the hijab? And I decided to keep it on. And although she brought, her sort of family members over to try and, talk me out of this, I was still very much committed to wearing the hijab. Because I think one of the things I wanted to highlight here was that this piece of fabric that I've got on my head here, although outwardly it's not very difficult to think that the hijab is about covering, right? It's about modesty. It's about being a good Muslim woman, if you want to call it that. But for me, it was the opposite. So rather than cover, I really felt that the veil here, this piece of fabric, was something that revealed the state of my heart. So I was more concerned with what the hijab revealed rather than what the hijab covered. Yeah. And for me, it revealed my heart, and it revealed that I had surrendered to the divine. And in doing so, I felt this real great sense of agency and autonomy, and it was from this place that I felt this great sense of empowerment. I felt so empowered in that moment that I'd reconnected with this faith that brought me this great sense of joy and connection. And it gave me this ability to be myself, to be judged on my own merits and my own skills rather than how I looked and how society wanted me to be, and so on and so forth. So I felt this real sense of empowerment, which is completely the opposite, isn't it, to what Muslim women are seen as. They're often seen as these oppressed beings who have to listen to their fathers and their brothers, and if they don't, then my gosh, they'll be met with wrath and sort of violence. So as I just said, this piece of fabric wasn't just covering my head. It was this real symbolism for me. It was a symbolism of this sacred connection between me and the divine. That's how I see sort of this hijab. I felt like it spoke with how I'd aligned with my higher self, which sounds interesting to speak to, because in that moment, I recognized that I'm here, I've been created, and there's a divine purpose that I've been created with too. And so in many respects, this is what I was connecting to. This is what I was becoming aware of. And in many ways, this piece of fabric kind of saved me. When Andrew and I were talking about this presentation, I was saying to him, for me as a brown South Asian woman, British woman living in the UK, I can't sort of remove racism and racial bigotry. I can't separate them into two compartments, because when I met with those things, when I met with racial slurs and I face race, and see that sort of racial bigotry, they oftentimes come in one package. So here for me, this piece of fabric now gave me this strength, this sense of empowerment, this sense of agency, this sense of autonomy to be able to withstand what I was met by the general public. And it was okay that they sometimes spoke like this or saw me in this way, because I felt like, I'd made it my life's work, so to speak, to I suppose, deal with that in a very different way. My inherent nature, as Hannah, is I have this ability to live and let live. I was an eternal optimist, and many occasions when I was a teenager and even in my adolescent years, I thought it was a terrible thing that I couldn't confront people or I wasn't very assertive. But I really see those things as now beautiful qualities. Other people made them seem like they weren't so good. Because in many ways, this is what sort of helped me and served me and protected me from becoming that stereotypical angry Black woman, or you hear of the angry brown woman too, that this is what people oftentimes thought they would see and receive when, they would shout these things out to me, or they would speak to me in this manner, or their treatment in some way would indicate that I'm somebody that's a threat, or I'm not welcome in this country, I need to go back to my country. But instead, what I was somebody who was this prolific feeler. I felt emotions, I read them on people's faces, I read them in their states. And here my midwifery really came in handy, because one of the things that I was able to do was I was able to depersonalize a lot of what I was met with. I really became emotionally attuned to other people. I read the situations, I learned how to hold myself, and how in holding myself, I could hold others. And I did this, how with lots of kindness, with lots of compassion, and with lots of love. It's not easy sometimes. I still feel hurt, I still feel pain. But one of the things that I see is that pain and ignorance can really make people behave out of character. And so if they only got to see me, if they got to receive the compassion and someone could hold and see their pain, then perhaps they would be different with me. And in almost every single situation and circumstance, that was certainly the case. And as I've already said, that although I felt hurt, and sometimes I did feel that sense of rejection and abandonment by these people, that, whoa, this is my country, I love England, I live here, I'm from here, but I'm made to feel like you're not welcome here, you're not from us. I remember one occasion sitting on a bus and riding to go and see a friend, and this elderly white English woman came to me and said to me, "Where are you from, dear?" And I looked at her quite confused, and I said, "I'm from here." And she looked at me and she said, No. She said, "I know you'd like to think you're from here, but you're not." And in that moment, feeling like this country is yours, feeling like this community is yours, and then with a few words being made to feel like you're a foreigner, you're not welcome, and this is not your country, does hurt. And even now, as I talk about it, there's still a little bit of a sting. But I was able to, in that moment, see that she didn't know me, she didn't understand me. And so I sat and listened to her, and then I explained to her how my father had come to this country. Then I remember talking to her and telling her where I was from in Lancashire. And then she said to me, "Oh yes, I do see, so yes, you are from here." And then she finally accepted that. So I chose to interpret the ugliness that was coming from ignorance, from fear, and I would effort to try and bring back safety and to now open up doorways of dialogue. And that's what I would say has been my motives when I've met this sort of ignorance, and I've met this threat, and I've met this, and sometimes you can't always do that, but in many cases I've been very successful in being able to. And I want to say to anybody who's not a Muslim who's watching this, if you do see a Muslim woman next time, do go up to her and do approach her, not just a Muslim woman, a man too. And if there's a curious sort of little inkling of something in there that you want to know more or you want to connect, then do so. You know, I've been asked all kinds of questions, and no question is a silly question. Every question has its place, you know. So I always say to people, you know, when you smile at somebody and your eyes connect, there's this natural curiosity that comes that, hey, you're different, but can I ask you a question? And look at the questions that I've been asked in the past. Have you got hair? Do you wash your hair? You know, that's a common one I always get. Do you wash your hair? Does your husband make you wear that? In the summer, I'll get, oh gosh, you must be so hot in that. And in the winter, oh, you must be lovely and warm. I get asked, if I do wash my hair, do I wash it with shampoo? I get told, am I allowed to take this off at home? I get asked, do I sleep at home with it on? A common question, believe it or not, is I'm asked, are you allowed to have sex? And I laugh at that, especially when you looked at the map that Andrew brought up earlier. And I always, you know, laugh back and say, hey, we populated half the world, you know? So yeah, I'm sure that's definitely the case. You know, or people will say to me, oh, I'd love one of those for a bad hair day. Or I'd get asked, do you speak English? Can you hear me? Or if I'm wearing different colors, I always make a point of wearing different colored scarves, because people will say to me, is there a special reason why you're wearing that special color? And believe it or not, and I get asked this even by Muslims I've not met before, are you a Muslim? Like, I'm wearing the headscarf, are you a Muslim? Like, yes, I am a Muslim. I've even been asked if, you know, many occasions they say, oh, I bet you wish you didn't have to wear that. I bet you wish you didn't have to, especially when someone who's not Muslim will see my head. They'll be like, oh, what a shame. I bet you wish you didn't have to wear that. And, you know, I listen to those things, and some people might take offense, but if you've got a question like this, but you feel like it's silly, or you feel like in some way you can't ask, please don't. Honestly, we don't mind. And sometimes we laugh and we joke about this. I strike up a conversation with everybody. My husband can't go anywhere with me, with the cashier at the supermarket, with the bus driver on the bus, with, you know, people at a bus stop, wherever it is, I'll strike up a conversation, because what my intention is, I want you to not feel sort of unsafe. I don't want you to feel threatened. I want you to know that I'm just like you. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a sister. You know, I have hopes, I have dreams, I have aspiration, and I'm no different to you. And I love this country and I love its people. And just because I wear a head covering and I believe in a God, and I follow these principles and these sort of tenets of faith, doesn't now make me any less of a person, or any sort of different to you in some of those common shared universal truths that you and I share as human beings. You know, that's what I wanted to kind of sort of share, if I can. And before I hand this back to Andrew and we go through sort of some of what we can do, I really wanted to say this here, that Gabor Mate said that safety is not just the absence of threat, but it's the presence of connection. And I extend to you the invitation for connection, you know, like whenever you meet another Muslim, you know, if I meet somebody, honestly, I'm like, come back to my house, let's have a cup of tea. I want to become best friends in 5 minutes. And it's when you can come into our homes and we're so welcoming, we love to feed you till you feel like you're going to burst, you know. I want you to sort of connect with that, connect over food, connect over gatherings. And although mosques are beautiful places and you could go to them, you're not going to really find real connection and attachment there to Muslims. It's in the homes, it's in their sort of more intimate spaces that you'll get to really know Muslims and Muslim culture. So, you know, that's my invitation to you. Next time you see a Muslim woman, please feel free to go up to her and ask her some questions, befriend her, welcome her. And this is by no means me assuming that you don't already do that. But if there is that apprehension, you know, I'll promise you that they're not going to be offended if you do go forward. So if I could invite sort of Andrew back into the discussion now, and perhaps sort of he and I can go through the next part, Andrew, where we're going to go through perhaps some of the solutions that we could maybe pose to you guys as the audience in terms of what you might be able to do. I'm just seeing if there's the less can I see, the more conservative I perceive it to be. Absolutely, and I can see that. Is there anything you'd like to answer there, Andrew, before we move on to the next part, or are you happy to move into the next part and we leave the question till after?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, so we're moving on. I did actually miss out a section here, which was, but I'm not, the slides will be available anyway from, so the last thing I actually forgot to present was what is Islamophobia? But you'll get the slides for that, and you can go through them yourself. So it's just a simple facts about the sort of Islamophobia that's rising in Europe specifically. It's the increase of that happening there. But I think it's important now we wrap things up and we talk about some of the solutions. So Hannah's covered a lot of the, whoops, 1 second. Covered many of the solutions that we're going to cover here anyway. Solutions. Yeah, so we as a people, I think it's important that we be curious about Muslims, and like Hannah said, visiting Muslims in their homes, rather than, often we have these sort of open day mosque visitations, but I think it's really important that we see Muslims in their natural habitat. Not all Muslims attend mosques, and you're not really going to get an idea of how Muslims are by just visiting a mosque. I think it's more important that we visit in their homes, and also attend some of their celebrations, whether it be a wedding, whether it be Eid, but to get a real sense of what they're like, Muslims in their own homes. The other thing is trying to find what things you generally find beautiful in Islam. So what things are you like, specifically in this presentation, what things have you connected to? What things have you not connected to? But really trying to find that balance so we can uncouple the fear and connect more to a connection and an appreciation of Islam, just like we would with any culture. What do we appreciate in Japanese culture? What do we appreciate in Chinese culture? What do we appreciate in African culture? And find the things that you really connect to. That doesn't mean that we have to adopt that faith, but we can at least appreciate and single out things that we find that are some things that we really connect to. I think it's really important, regardless of who you are as a people, that we have to realize that prejudice is a very dangerous thing, and information used into statistics and information is a very dangerous thing if it leads to harm of others. So no prejudice in American history has ever been overcome without a critical mass of the broader society standing up and saying, not in my name. We need to create a we. There's another factor in terms of the Islamophobia, I think. Many of the Muslim scholars speak about that Islamophobia will always be present as long as we're in the political and economic climate we're in, because there's geopolitical interests and developments that are in the continue to feed Islamophobia in the West, and will continue into the next generation. And so we have to, we can't obviously always address this us as individuals, but we have to realize that many global conflicts pertain to energy and land. And so to reduce Islamophobia, it's really important that we develop and refine more renewable sources and rely less on the Middle East for its resources. And also, I think a really important thing is finding a peaceful resolution between Israel and Palestine conflict. Gina Ross is doing some wonderful work as who's part of the Somatic Experiencing community with her own Trauma Healing Institute in Israel, is really bringing Palestinians and Israelis together to really try to heal some of these wounds between them. I think as long as that conflict's happening in the Middle East, there will always be there'll be a desire from some camps to fuel this Islamophobia for people's own agendas. So I think that's a very important thing as well. And to finish on this quote, this is a quote by Martin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Martin Niemöller, who was a Lutheran pastor who was in Germany, who ended up as a prisoner in the concentration camps as a result of speaking out against the Nazi excesses against the Jews. He said, first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came out for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. So I think that really summarizes beautifully the danger of any sort of hate-fueled speech, and taking statistics, taking information, just with the intention to demonize a people, what it eventually will lead to. And we've got history to tell us that. And some recommended reading, if people wish to know a bit more about Islamophobia, these books by Todd H. Green. And there's a wonderful book that one of my favorite books is Commander of the Faithful, The Life of Times of Emir Abdul Qadir by John W. Kaiser. And then these are my contact details. I think Hannah will share hers as well. And we send out we give the slides to the Somatic Experiencing Institute for them to be shared out with you all anyway. Hannah, was there anything else that you wanted to?
I think you covered all the points really well there, Idris. Thank you. But I just wanted to say and extend a really heartfelt gratitude to Somatic Experiencing sort of Trauma Institute, to Rebecca, to Madeline, and to Laura for inviting us and giving us this opportunity and this really wonderful, very welcoming platform, and to be able to share and hopefully, sort of come together as a community to see how we can really heal some of these wounds that we experience when we meet some of the ugly parts of our our human family. So thank you very much for that. And I wanted to thank Andrew as well in being a really great co-presenter as well. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Hannah. No problem. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much. If anyone's got any questions or would like to make a comment about what we've seen, what they've seen here today, then please do message or leave a comment in the chat box. We'd be delighted to hear or answer anything we can.
Yeah. Madeline, is there anything? I mean, I see one question there about the history. I purposely didn't go too deep into the history because that's a whole topic in itself. So I kept it very brief. I do apologize for that. Someone asking about the history between the great game fought in Afghanistan and the British Empire versus Russia. I mean, fundamentally, it's just to show how a lot of this discrimination is fueled by politics and economical interests, and how people's images can change depending on the economical and political situation. Oh, right. This chat box was disabled.
All right, sorry.
Madeline, is there anything else?
There was no other questions submitted at this time, but everyone that's on this webinar, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Or I know Andrew gave his contact information.
Yeah, Hannah, if you wanted to share anything in terms of your contact details.
I've got them if anybody did want to. I'd have to go into another sort of presentation. Just one moment and we'll get my details up, sorry.
If you send it to us as well, I can include it in the email to everyone.
Oh, great. Would that be better to do then, rather than bring it up here now?
Yeah, whatever you'd like. We'll send all of the registrants, so even the people who weren't able to attend live will get the recording, and then if you share your PowerPoint and contact info, we can give that to everyone. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Sure. I'll do.
Great.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Well, on behalf of the Institute, I just want to thank you both for being so generous and so kind and so open. And yes, thank you so much for the opportunity.
No problem, Rebecca. It's our pleasure, Rebecca. Thank you for extending your invitation to us.
It was my pleasure. And on that note, thank you everyone for attending. And we will be sending out the recording with the presentations within 3 to 5 business days. And
would that be available on YouTube as well, Rebecca?
It will be available on our website.
Okay.
Yes, on our anti-oppression series video.
Okay. Yeah, we'll upload it to YouTube, and then we have a special section on our resources page with the webinars from this series.
Okay,
So
brilliant.
lots of options. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Yes, thank
Have a
you.
wonderful day or evening, wherever you are.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.